Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's edition of Costa. I'm your host. My name is Andrew Mwansa, sitting in for Costa Mwansa. Now, the Bank of Zambia has announced that it will introduce new banknotes for the local currency on the 31st of March 2025. The updated currency will include the introduction of 500 kwacha and 200 kwacha notes. Additionally, the new coins will be issued in denominations of 5 kwacha, 2 kwacha, and 1 kwacha, along with smaller units of 15 ngwe, 10 ngwe, and 5 ngwe, respectively. Meanwhile, at its February 10th to 11th 2025 meeting, the Monetary Policy Committee decided to increase the monetary policy rate by 50 basis points to 14.5%. This is intended to steer inflation back to 6 to 8% target band and help anchor inflation expectations, which are observed to have persisted. Tonight, on this edition of Costa, we look at the implications of these decisions that have come from the Bank of Zambia and what they mean for the broader economy. My guest is PwC Country Partner Andrew Chibuye. Joining us on channel 271 on DSTV and channel 20 on GoTV, but also you are joining this stream live on our Facebook page. That's at Diamond TV Online. And so if you haven't liked the page yet, go to our Facebook page and click on the link at Diamond TV Online to get updated versions of what we have here on Diamond TV Zambia. Tonight we look at the increase in the MPR and the introduction of new banknotes and coins. Like I said earlier on, my guest tonight is PwC Country Partner in Andrew Chibuye. Mr. Chibuye, good evening. Thank you so much for making time to be with us on Costa tonight.
Good evening. Thanks for having me, Andrew. You can say we're machine.
Of course. Yeah. Happy New Year. It's the first time I'm seeing you this year.
Happy New Year to you too. It's good to see you.
Very, some would say controversial pronouncements that have come from the Bank of Zambia last week. Obviously, the big one is the fact that there's going to be an introduction of a new, family of banknotes and coins starting the 31st of next month, that is March. I'd like to find out. I think let's begin from there. What is your, reaction to this announcement from the Bank of Zambia?
Yeah, I've seen the discourse. I'm not too surprised because there's obviously different schools of thought and sentiment expressed in reaction to the action that have been taken. But myself, not too surprised actually. And as a follower of sort of economic development, monetary policy, and I've had the opportunity to study how the Bank of Zambia regulates currency and oversees the whole currency environment. What I know is that it's first and foremost at the very basic. It's not unusual for the bank to print notes, replace notes on an ongoing basis, right? That's why sometimes you walk up to the ATM, you get some fairly clean notes, the notes that you don't even want to spend, you know what I mean? No? So that happens periodically. That is business as usual, okay? The one that is less common, that is also happens at intervals, is where the entire family of banknotes or currency in terms of its structure is reviewed and changed, as is the case now. And that happens for various reasons, right? I know as a fact that the currency in terms of how it's monitored and how because about what's the most optimal structure for notes, coins, and currency in issue is monitored quite closely. There's a science to it. It's not guesswork. Notes and how they circulate in the economy and create value is something that is monitored on an ongoing basis. So you get to a point where there's a question of what's the most efficient structure or the most optimal structure for currency currency in the economy in order to facilitate transactions in the most efficient manner. And for where we were getting to with where inflation has been, especially, you find you need more and more cash to do the same things. Now that's there are various reasons why the currency will change, but the most controversial, the most discussed has been, what does this mean for the state of the economy? What does it mean for the value of the currency in essence? And I think the central bank has been quite open. It's an open secret because of how inflation has evolved over the recent years. You're getting less and less out of the same value. So obviously the currency has lost value. If the currency has lost value, then that it just means the current family of banknotes is not as efficient as it should be in terms of facilitating transactions. So you have to review that, and that's what has happened at the moment. So for me, it's not too surprising.
But the last time Zambia rebased its currency, it was to manage hyperinflation. And given the current trends, is the country heading towards another currency rebase in the near future?
I don't think so. If you remember, those days were what? The biggest note was 50,000. 50,000. You had 3 zeros knocked off, and then you had the introduction of 100 kwacha note, if I remember correctly. 2012, I think, was when a currency was rebased. The reality of the situation is that inflation has continued to increase, and that's what has brought us to this point where you now need, in order to facilitate transactions more efficiently, slightly higher value banknotes. The question of, does it mean we're heading to hyperinflation or a situation where in a short period of time we'll need to review the structure of banknotes? That depends on what happens with inflation. Now, controlling inflation is something which I think it's another subject of discussion. I think it's what we'll cover when we deal with the monetary policy discussion, but that is one of the major elements as to why the structure has changed. But that's not the only reason, right? It's a big part of it, but it's not the only reason. The other factors that have been put forward, which I think are fair, and I guess everyone can make judgments for themselves. Since 2012 to now, there's not been a major overhaul in the design of currency, both in terms of its security features as well as how durable it is. And in addition to that, there's something interesting the Bank of Zambia mentioned, that they actually undertook consultations with the visually impaired to adjust the notes to make them easier for those who are impaired in terms of sight to use. Things like changing the dimensions of each of the notes, imagining that once you're adept with using your hands to sense certain things, they'll be able to tell the minute differences and actually tell the notes apart, which I think is fantastic. The other thing is, since 2012 to now, technology has changed. Your counterfeiters are a lot more sophisticated, so a lot more security features embedded in this family of notes, which I think one can argue you could have embedded them without changing the structure, right? But that's another, the opportunity has been taken to actually do that, which I think is also positive, making them more durable. I think the other bit which I'm personally waiting to see how it unfolds is that with a bigger push towards a cashless society, what are we actually trying to achieve? So what I would expect then is that if, let's say for argument's sake, in the old currency, say we've got 100 million in circulation. Let's keep it very simple. I know there are several billions in circulation. Let's say the 100 million, right? Do you then take out 100 million in old notes and then only put in 80 million in value in new notes in the new structure, such that you still expect the transactions to be happening, but more through electronic means, and then actually reduce the value of currency in circulation? That one, I'm not sure how we'll actually achieve it, because at the same time your economy continues to grow. But if you assume the sort of steady state, that's what you would hope to happen. So those are some of the factors that are there.
It's a contradiction from the side of the Bank of Zambia, because just last year they had announced that we are looking at going cashless and digital, and with the announcement now that there's a new currency coming in, doesn't that contradict what they had already made as a plan for how we're going to manage our money system in our country.
Yeah, and that was my point, that it remains to be seen how they'll actually implement the new family in terms of the family of notes. We have to acknowledge that not every part of the country at the moment is as engaged in terms of digital finance. It's growing. I look at the stats on a fairly regular basis, and it's growing phenomenally in terms of how electronic money is being used, but it's still a fact. There are still a number of places where cash is still king. So you sort of have to factor in everybody, right? That not everybody is technologically savvy at the moment, so it's unlikely my grandmother, for example, will be very comfortable. I mean, actually, come to think of it, I've got a grandmother who I send money to using mobile money, so it is growing, but even when you send to her, you hear she wants to withdraw all of it, and then she's comfortable using cash from there. So it takes a while before you shift behavior. So it goes back to the point, how do you actually implement it? If, for argument's sake, you got $1 billion kwacha in circulation, in old notes, when you withdraw them, do you then only put a value of 800 million so that you actually force the issue? But I'm sure there are clever people at the Bank of Zambia who are looking into that, so that, and it's going to be a phased process, right? So it's not as though all the old currency is coming out on the 31st of March. I think there's like a year transition period. So I'm sure in the process, and I know this because I followed even the rebasing process, is that they'll be monitoring how much is being withdrawn, how much is being injected. So the ideal should be less should be injected than is being withdrawn. Then you start to force the issue of actual digital cash and transactions.
Larger banknotes often come with risks such as price rounding and inflationary pressures. How does the Bank of Zambia plan to prevent business from using this as a pretext to raise prices?
Well, I'm not sure the Bank of Zambia can actually do very much about it, right? Because, Bank of Zambia, their role is to provide the currency. Who determines the prices is the vendor, whoever is selling. So here then is where, for example, how competitive is an industry, right? So if the price of something is 450, and now because there's a 500 kwacha note, a player in the industry thinks they can push it to 500, will the environment allow them, right? In terms of other competitors, but also you and me, the consumer, who in this environment I'd expect is a lot more price sensitive, right? So if you go and find a 10% hike in what you were buying, you may look around a bit more. So on the other side, there's competitive pressure, obviously, to try and which a seller will think about in terms of that. The Bank of Zambia can't really intervene in terms of a particular market in terms of setting prices. So that is left to competitive forces. From some of the research I've done, the risk is there, but not that significant. There's also an issue of, there's a psychology around money, right? I mean, I'm not an expert on money and its psychology, but even you and me, when you've got, give or take 500 kwacha notes in your pocket, there's a way you behave relative to when you've got 50 kwacha notes or whatever it is, right? So there is a psychology around money, and buyer behavior, consumer behavior, which does play a part, but I think overall competitive forces plus price sensitivity of customers is what is sort of supreme in that particular situation. But I'm sure there are experts on money and psychology thereof who can give a fairly solid answer on this one.
We've seen a trend the past few months of the devaluing of our currency. The kwacha has been depreciating. What would you attribute the depreciation to?
So when you say depreciation, we obviously have to contextualize it, right? Because if you look at it from an exchange rate point of view, we did have a phase where we had fairly rapid depreciation, and then it sort of held. Previously, it was holding below 27, so it would come to 27, it goes down to about 25. Now it's holding at around 28, around that area. right? So that's one aspect. If we compare our currency against other major currencies, most notably the US dollar. The other bit obviously is inflation, which is, even without considering the dollar of foreign currency, what you were able to buy a year ago today with 100 kwacha, you can't buy, right? So you can see it in reality when you go into the store. So there's two things, and I think they're interlinked, right? So ultimately, it's an inflation question, right? Because the value of what you're able to procure using available notes is depreciating because the price is going up. Why has the price been going up consistently? You then need to interrogate what are the drivers of inflation in the country. If you interrogate what are the drivers of inflation, where are those drivers of inflation actually getting the impetus from? And when you sort of break it down, you figure out that inflation largely in Zambia is bucketed into two: food items and non-food items, right? Both, I think, are affected in a great degree with what's happening with currency, because we import a lot of what we consume, both food and non-food items. So if your currency is depreciating and you're now paying more to import, that is bringing higher prices into the country. When you then consider those prices relative to what they were before, you have a loss of value, right? So that's a significant aspect. Why is the currency depreciating? It's really a function of the productivity of the economy. We're importing more than we export. Copper, which is our biggest export, has for a number of years been in decline, I think from about 2021 through to 2023. 2024 was a better year, but still hasn't yet got back even, from what we've been told, actually has exceeded 2021 levels, because 2021 was about 802,000 tons of copper exported, 763 in 2023. In 732 in 2023. When we come to 2024, we've rebounded to 821 or 824, somewhere there, 820,000 tons. Now, it's going to take a while before that works itself through. What else is happening from an import perspective, which is putting pressure on the currency? It's electricity. We're told anywhere between 90, 120, 130 million dollars per month, is needed to import power that is supporting the economy, because we have a generation issue, right? So if you remember as well, tariffs have had to be adjusted in order to facilitate those imports. Those are contributing to non-food inflation. That's a big part of the non-food inflation component. Other things, whether it's what are we exporting as much as we should? Probably not. The overall productivity of the economy, especially because of load shedding, fuel, you add that to the mix, add to that we now have a higher demand for foreign currency for debt service, which commenced in 2024. All of those factors, you put them together, you have pressure on the currency, depreciation in the currency. That depreciation in the currency now working its way into the local economy because of the prices going up. The prices are going up. That means more inflation. More inflation means the value of your currency is reducing. So that, when you ask the question about what's really driving the loss of value in the currency, it's inflation. But if you think about it, it's interlinked with what's happening with the exchange rate, what's happening with and what's driving that, and dependency on imports, what's happening with the overall productivity of the economy. That's also key. And then ultimately, generally,
if I listen to you, those sound like very difficult factors to be able to just sort out in a single day. Is there anything that we can do as a country at the moment to be able to address issues of the devaluing of our currency?
So ultimately, you've put it correctly, and this is linked to now the discussion of what's been happening with the Monetary Policy Committee and some of the statements there, right? Because ultimately, inflation, the country, you never hear, it's rare, I'm not aware of a country that targets negative inflation, right? So even Zambia, with the intent of growing its economy tremendously for the benefit of its citizens, its inflation target is 6 to 8%, right? Have you asked yourself the question, why aren't we targeting negative inflation, right? We actually target some inflation, and some inflation means ultimately your currency, you're expecting your currency will lose some value, right? Now, the reason why you still target some inflation, although the qualification is a country, for it to grow sustainably, you want moderate to low to moderate inflation, which is consistent, right? The reason why you want that is that inflation also is a signal around the productivity of the economy. If you look at it in principle, what you're saying is that the money that is being the economic transactions that are happening in the country that are producing money, how many goods are they actually chasing? All right. So inflation is, in theory, a situation where you have too much money chasing too few goods. All right. Too much money chasing too few goods, if we try and simplify it. Now, what happens if you have too much money chasing too few goods? If, for example, there are 10 people who want to come and buy these 2 bottles of water, and all of them have got money, what will happen is we who are selling will do what? Raise the prices, right? If there's nobody, right, who's coming to buy this, we'll now start, or there's only one person. So if one person comes here, you're a vendor, I'm a vendor, we'll do our best to get that one. We may reduce the prices. So if you use that as an analogy, right, if we're reducing the prices, that's negative inflation, right? What is happening is that it's actually telling you that there's a problem in the economy. Why is there only one person coming to buy from me and you? If we need to reduce our prices to secure a sale, you and me will be out of business in a short amount of time, right? But if there are 5 or 6 people who are coming for these goods, and in addition to these 2, we are manufacturing and bringing to the table for the 5 who have come to buy, that means we'll be able to either maintain our prices or increase them only moderately. They'll be able to afford, you and me will be able to operate sustainably. That's why an economy targets low to moderate inflation, which is consistent over a period of time, because it actually tells you that things are happening in the economy in terms of its productivity for both the producers and those who are procuring. Yeah. So
maybe for people that might get confused in your explanation, Mr. Chibuye. So now you explained that, for example, now we've got our inflation is very high at the moment as a country.
60 going towards 17. Yeah.
Yes, it's goes towards 17, and you explained that inflation is so much money chasing fewer goods. All right.
That's one of the simple explanations.
One of the simple explanations. Do you think this is what's happening in our country, that there's so much money and there's few goods that people are chasing?
Okay, that's one definition of inflation at its most basic. All right.
In the Zambian context, what do you?
The other way of looking at it. So there's let's put it in a different context as well. Okay, because there's different types of inflation: cost push and demand pull. Right. Yeah. Now, let's put it very simply. Okay, inflation is the rate at which prices increase. Okay, if we even simplified earlier than our previous discussion, it's the rate at which prices increase. What we were explaining is why do those prices increase, right? They increase because there's a healthy degree of productivity and there's also capacity to absorb the productivity that's coming, okay? But if we go even a step before that, inflation is the rate at which prices increase, okay? Now, what I was describing is what you call demand pull inflation. What I explained earlier, where we are importing, and by virtue of importing and bringing goods and services into the country, in an environment where the currency is depreciating, we are importing things which are becoming more expensive. So we are bringing higher costs into the country. If we were importing this bottle of water for $1, it costs $1. A year ago, if the exchange rate was 20, today we would sell it at 20. This bottle of water, if we're importing it, today is 28. Where we're buying from, it's still $1. When we bring it here, it's now 28, right? We have introduced inflation into the country because in this case, we've singled out one variable. That variable is exchange rate, okay? So in this case, we have cost push inflations where we have brought costs, added costs into our environment. And that is what's happening in Zambia. the relevance of the other discussion which we just had about money chasing goods, now you have to link to what is being done to try and control inflation, because we know that inflation, if uncontrolled, it devastates the economy, right? Because what you're earning today, today you're able to buy 5 bags of mini meal for your family and extended family. The salary has remained the same. In a month's time, you can only buy 4. That's not good, right? So how do you try and moderate that? Okay. Now, the theory that's there in what, for example, the Monetary Policy Committee is trying to do, which is what you alluded to in your introduction, where monetary policy rate has been increased by 50 basis points, right, to 14.5, is you're now trying to manage the amount of money in the economy so that you stifle demand. If you stifle demand, okay, so if we use my earlier analogy, we had 5 people, 10 people, right? Is there a way that we can remove 5 of them so that we remain with 5? If we only have 5, then the pressure for the cost prices to go up will subside, because instead of 10 potential buyers, we now only have 5, okay? This is suboptimal. You don't want that, right, at the end of the day, but it's a last resort, all right? So what the Monetary Policy Committee is doing is, when we adjust, the theory is that if we adjust interest rates, there are people who are borrowing, who have borrowed, and those who are borrowing, their ability to spend will reduce, because now they'll spend more money servicing debt. All right, that's what you're trying to do. Okay, now that is not, it's not a great situation to be in, especially for a sustained period. There are other things which the Monetary Policy Committee has done in terms of managing liquidity. Managing liquidity is managing the buying power of the consumer. All right, what you want is your consumer to have as much buying power as they want, so that they can do what they need to do with you don't need to control them when it comes to what they buy.
The APR has been increasing on an annual basis.
Yes.
Do we seem to get it right? Because annually we see the Bank of Zambia.
It's been increasing. Yeah. So, and that's where we were going to, right? So that's what they're trying to do. But the real solution, if you understand the discussion that we've had in terms of how is inflation actually manifesting in Zambia, is that when you're adjusting the monetary policy rate at the end, it's not the real issue. The real issue, the biggest issue, is what we've talked about earlier. How much cost are we importing into Zambia because the currency is unstable, because we have to bring in electricity at higher tariffs, etc., etc. So there is an indirect relationship between what the Bank of Zambia is doing, but it's there, and where the real cause of the problem is. Now, if you allow me, let me try and break it down in a way that we understand how this gets resolved thoroughly or comprehensively, right? So it's like you go to let's not assume, but let's not assume it's you, but someone walks into the hospital and they've got a headache, right? When they get into the hospital, the doctor will say, take 3 painkillers, okay? This is now, we're in the monetary policy environment. So Zambia walks into the hospital. Let's use Zambia. Let's imagine Zambia is a patient. We need to give you 3 painkillers, okay? The pain may subside for a while, but we haven't really treated the real problem, okay? So that is what the monetary policy adjustments do. They are meant to provide direction, they are meant to provide some stability, but they are not the fundamental in terms of how you actually address the big issue. Then we take patient Zambia to the specialist. The specialist does some tests, MRI, etc., CT scan, etc. Says, you know what, we think you have a slightly bigger problem. We'll do some minimal invasive surgery, maybe send you for physio. We see what you can do so that we get to the root cause. You may be taking painkillers, but if we don't deal with the real problem, you still won't be well. You need painkillers. That's why the painkiller has been the monetary policy rate being adjusted consistently. It's not fixing the real problem. It's meant to just bring bring some degree of stability. You see, inflation hasn't fallen off the cliff. The exchange rate has been depreciating, but it only depreciates to a certain level, then it sort of bounces and leaves. So this bit now in the middle is, what is government doing? Let's put that as the second line of treatment. Is government controlled in its borrowing, right? Because if government is in this environment where there's monetary policy pressure this side, pressure on the economy, if government is borrowing too much, you're making the problem worse. Is government spending within its budget? Are we resolving the issue around debt? Because if we don't sort that out, which we are, right, but it still needs to be concluded so that you attract more investment, you bring down the cost of funding. So a lot of this, the second line is, what sort of policies do we have? Are the policies favorable? Is the tax regime favorable? Etc., etc. So this is government doing what they need to do. Looking at Zambia and saying, yeah, well, monetary policy is trying, but we still have issues that we need to deal with. If we're going to deal with the root cause of the problem, right? Are we stimulating more exports? Are we reducing imports in favor of local manufacturing, import substitution, those sorts of things? Then you now come to the final treatment where you say, you know what, we need open heart surgery here. We figured out the real problem. You need major surgery, maybe even some transplants. We take some things out which are not working, we put in new organs, right? That is now fixing the private sector, right? Because the economy can only be driven by the private sector at the end of the day, right? So what's the private sector doing? How effective are they? Where is mining today? Where is agriculture today? Where is tourism? What's happening with ICT, with education? All the bits of the economy, how are they functioning, right? So if you fix that, then your exports go up, your incomes for workers go up. Remember, if you're getting paid more, then you have less pressure even if the costs are going up. Your quality of living will be sustained. So if you fix the private sector, you enable the private sector to drive the economy. If you give them the tools, or they have the tools to actually drive the economy, then you move. And that's why there's such a big focus on driving investment, opening up the mining sector, sorting out agriculture, growing tourism. I heard some fantastic numbers in terms of arrivals just from the other week, and then you move from there. Because once you have a more productive economy, then what will happen? Your exchange rate will moderate. When your exchange rate moderates from 28 to 24 or 23, this, which we're buying for $1, okay, prices are sticky upwards. They rise quickly and they come down slowly. Now there'll be the people competing and selling this water, which they're both importing at $1. One will say, you know what, even at 24, I can make a profit, and you adjust to 24. The other one will say, you know what, I can make profit even at 23.5, right? So your prices start to moderate downwards. So that's how you fix this issue. So if you think about it, you've got your primary, this, which is just like a stopgap measure, just like painkillers. That's what the monetary policy is. And that's why it hasn't been as effective as you wanted to see, because there are bigger problems down the line. You've got this, but actually, it's not as though they're even like happening in sequence or consecutively. They're actually happening concurrently, right? Because the government is doing what it needs to do. Debt is almost at the end in terms of renegotiation. There's an issue of dealing with local debt. Government borrowing is a lot more controlled. The government fiscal posture is a lot better. And then on the other side, there's massive investment going into different sectors. The challenge that you have now is that treatment number 3 takes a while.
I was about to ask that, because I think if you look at if you look at the paper and what government is doing and what the private sector are doing, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
But looks like we've been very slow. The impact is not yet being felt.
Yeah.
What is causing this, slowness in people getting to feel
the effects?
The effects of some of these policies.
I hear you, and I think about this a lot. And let's be like, if we're just objective, right? If you rewind to even just say 2020, right? So what has Zambia's economic journey been in the last few years? 2020, we defaulted on sovereign debt in November, right? And some people say it's not, we're looking backwards, we need to be talking about solutions. For you to diagnose and treat a problem, you need to understand where it's coming from, right? So you need the full context. You default, that has its ramifications, right? The only reason why Zambia's economy didn't fall off a cliff is that our creditors gave us a grace period, and they decided to hold back to to see how we would restructure. In the COVID period, actually, they gave us debt standstill, right? So you come out of debt, you default, you go straight into dealing with a pandemic, right? The pandemic had its effects, which we also, you deal with that, the world starts to get a lot more unstable. You now have pressure, petroleum prices are rising, commodity supply chains are being disrupted, Russia and Ukraine and all that. And we've continued to see geopolitics evolve in different ways, right? From Russia and Ukraine, what's happening in the Middle East. Now we are thinking about how the change in US policy will affect Zambia. Will other donors follow suit? What will that mean for Zambia? You're having to contend with all of these. You had a season when the mining sector was in decline. I gave you the numbers. 2021, 802,000 tons copper. 2022, the number was 763. 2023, it was 732, right? The graph was downwards despite a fairly elevated price. What did that do to the economy? You're dealing with that. You've still got issues with debt restructuring that are unfolding. You come out of that, now you've got the drought and your climate change. So when you put all of these into one pot and mix them up, right, what has that meant for Zambia's ability to just get on with it, right? It means the ability has been constrained, because when you think about whether there's massive investment which has gone into mining, the incentives that have gone for manufacturing for export purposes, what has happened with tourism being opened up, a lot of that will be, you have a plus this side and some very heavy minuses this side. And now you have, especially the energy crisis, the energy and food crisis have been just devastating, because the effect of energy deficit, to the extent that we've had it permeates everywhere. Its effect is pervasive, right? You can't deny that. From the largest corporate to the SME and the individual, no matter what you're doing, you have been affected. And that is why, on one hand, you would have had some significant inputs to try and stimulate the economy. On the other hand, it's like pouring water into a basket which has holes. So whatever efforts you're pouring in, a lot of them are being washed away.
How much economically independent are we as a country? Because looking at your explanations, you explain very, very well when you explain of how the external factors have been able to really affect our growth as a country. You speak of the COVID-19 pandemic, to the drought, to the to the wars in Ukraine and wars in the Middle East. All these have got their effects on us as a country.
Yeah.
But isn't our economy that strong enough to be able to absorb some of these shocks when they come through? Or how do we create a more resilient economy to be able to absorb some of these external shocks?
You're absolutely right that we have to be in a position where we can control our future and our fate. And there are a number of things that we have to do. We've been talking about diversifying the economy for I don't know how long. The way that you insulate yourself, I mean, if you think about it, let's put it simply, right? If you're an employee today and there's a risk you may lose your job, how do you insulate yourself from the risk you may lose your job? You may have alternative sources of income, right? That is what is meant by the country diversifying. And for a long time, the country has had its source of income as copper, and there was a risk that copper, for example, would come under pressure. It didn't create, quote unquote, a sufficiently large side hustle to compensate. I think everyone should be able to understand that terminology. So what are you then going to do? What must we do? It means the story that we've had for many years, that agriculture needs to go, tourism needs to go, manufacturing needs to rebound, right? We used to have a vibrant manufacturing sector in Zambia. I grew up in Ndola. I know, right? I used to see it in the industrial area in Ndola. To this day, we haven't yet gotten back to those levels. But a lot of it for me is less about talk and strategy and plans. It's really about implementation. And if you remember the treatment plan that we spoke about, a lot of this has to do with a thriving private sector that's actually driving this charge. Government is not government's business to create business and drive the economy. Theirs is to create an environment where you have entrepreneurs, the private sector, businesses, individuals who do what they need to do to actually, as they do what they do now drive this economy and drive it forward. There's a huge opportunity at the moment because we are still endowed with vast resources from a mining perspective. Utilizing those and then successfully pivoting sustainable agriculture, and I use the word sustainable because we now know that climate change and extreme weather events are likely to become the norm going forward, right? So in some years we may have no more rainfall, but it comes at a completely different time. That means we have to be dynamic in terms of how we adapt, how we use technology in terms of making sure we are doing the right things and creating value locally. That's how you. So, what have I said? The biggest is you have to diversify the economy. You need a private sector that's thriving, a government that's providing the right environment, and that's how you deal with it. And the point around resilience, I think, is really what this whole season has proven, because the country has been battered from every single direction. And when you look at when you look at other countries, some of these factors are not unique to Zambia, but Zambia appears to have gone to a place which is much worse than some of our neighbors and our peers. So I think it's really, once this season is sort of overcome, we move forward collectively. That has been difficult, and even when we talk about there's massive investment going into different sectors, my point is always that investment has to benefit the citizen, the common man on the street. Now, let's add another dimension, is that with debt restructuring, we are now servicing debts that we were not servicing before. That means the economy needs to grow to such an extent that it not only services debt, because there's no, beyond this I doubt there's room for renegotiation, right, once we've agreed and we're going. But if the only thing that we do is service debt and don't improve the livelihood of the citizens, then that for me doesn't look like success. So the economy needs to be a lot more resilient. We need to give the private sector the tools to drive this. I mean, I'm not saying it hasn't been done, but we need to see how it can be done even to a greater
extent. With inflation around 16 to 17%, the objective of the increase in the MPR by the Bank of Zambia was for them to be able to maintain, inflation or target. The target is between 6 to 8%, band. Do you see this as a realistic target?
Not in the short term. And even the Bank of Zambia is clear on that. Not in the short term. I think, for all intents and purposes, I think the projections are 2026, I think, is when you start getting back to those levels. But let's look at, so if you just say it in abstract, then perhaps it may seem that even that is unreasonable. But let's see what's happening, right? So what are the main causes of inflation? Food, non-food, right? Now, if you look at the food side, the biggest problem we've had is the food deficit in the recent past. God willing, if the rains continue as they are, and hopefully we learn a thing or two about how we plan for this. Because remember, we knew that there will be El Nino before. So one of the key questions is, what did we do, right? So we have to learn something. We can't keep going through paying the same school fees over and over. But let's go back to that. So on this long list of problems, let's hope that the issue of food deficit is cancelled out, right? If that's cancelled out, then it reduces the pressure on the food side of the inflation equation. Just one, right? If we produce more of what we can and import less, again, that will reduce pressure in the food column on the inflation computation. If you go on the non-food side, it's unlikely that the big contributor in the recent past is energy and the need to import electricity at an elevated price in order to sustain. It's unlikely that we'll get back to pre-crisis tariffs, if you ask me, right? And even if, say, ZESCO moderated its tariff, each of us has now got an effective tariff, which is higher, right? So if you're having to run a genset, you're having to buy alternative power and install it yourself, you also have a tariff, right? Independent of, which is incremental to what ZESCO is currently charging you, right? So will we go back to pre-levels? I don't think so, at least not in the short term. And even I think life has changed from an energy solution. We will likely, though, be better able to cope and operate in the type of environment where energy is constrained. There'll be more generation coming on board eventually, which will cushion, but I think the tariffs remain elevated. Then what should happen is, if the economy starts to get back to normal levels of productivity, even if prices do not come down significantly, if people then have access to greater opportunity to generate more money or more resources to cope with the higher cost of living, then you improve the quality of living. That is one of the ways that you deal with this. So you may look at inflation and say, okay, how do you control it? The more probable thing that we're going to do is look at incomes. How do we give people more money? How do people end up with more money so that the higher costs are less of a problem? Or how do we give people an opportunity to have income rising at a rate which is higher than the rate at which costs are rising? That's how you then improve people's livelihoods. So if you then put that together, you can see that at some point, and if you then have all this productivity from the mining sector come through, which is already happening. So if you look at 2023, you ended at 732 for copper. 2024, you ended at 820,000 tons in terms of production, and there's a lot which is coming online. The target for this year is 1,075,000, and it actually doesn't seem too unrealistic given everything that's happening, all things being equal. If that all comes through, then all of a sudden you have more foreign currency in supply. More foreign currency means less pressure on the kwacha. Less pressure on the kwacha means imports become cheaper. They become cheaper. It works its way into the inflation equation with lower food and non-food.
Do you see this in the short term?
Short term, no. No, that's what I was saying.
Because I was also be reminded of the fact that obviously this year, beginning last year into this year, I think we've seen a lot of opening up of the mining sector. Many of the mines that weren't operating are now operating, and they've seen that there's been reopening of other mines and new mines also, have been reopened. But also these are long-term projects.
Yes.
For you to begin to see the fruits of the mining sector, it takes a while. And so, should people expect a good life, let's say, by end of this year?
So the question is, what are we all doing, right? Because we also have a responsibility in this equation. So your first question was around inflation. In the short term, I don't think it's realistic. But when you put all of those things together, when they start to bear the dividends that you can see are already starting to manifest or are likely to manifest, it means that either the inflation will be moderated or incomes will start to increase to compensate for the higher cost. When you talk about can people expect a good life in this year, I expect it to still be tough for a number and improve. What will be there, what I expect is that there will be more opportunities for entrepreneurs, individuals to actually earn a living, right? Who those individuals are will depend on those who are able to spot those opportunities and capitalize on them. So when you look at, I use this as a simple example sometimes, right? Because sometimes when these things are happening, we think, oh, the mining sector, there's 2 billion announced in Barrick, and they're doing a super pit. Kansanshi is spending 1.3 billion on their S3 project, 1.25 on their S3 project, and 100 million on nickel, right? Or the easy one maybe to understand is somewhere like Luansha, where CNMC is revamping Shaft 28, right? The CNMC first made that announcement in April of 2023 that we are revamping the Shaft 28, we're going to pump out the water and we're going to get moving, right? If we sit back, we say, what opportunity is there in that 1.3 billion? There's nothing, right? But when you think about it, by the time CNMC moves on the ground, starts dewatering, how many people have they brought into the they might have said, just get it. It's been idle for a while. And you'd have put up a structure. Today, I would bet you, if you did that, you would be oversold in terms of accommodation because of the activity next door. Or you could go and try and do that now, and they'll tell you, no. Now, the value has shifted, right? So that's really, so who is going to take advantage of all of these things which are happening and position themselves to benefit is up to us as citizens. Either we say there is nothing, or we wait for the opportunities to become complain, by which point it might be too late to actually get value, if you take my example as a reasonable one, on just what happened in March. So that's how it is. So for some, there will be massive opportunity. For others, perhaps not. But I think also what's important to note is that the government is doing quite a lot to support, especially those who are the least privileged in terms of what happens from a budget perspective. And hopefully that continues through the system. But what you want is for those to be weaned off that kind of support and find meaningful employment in all these other industries that you hope will then open up.
Still on the NPR, Mr. Chibuye, obviously what we understand is that now borrowing costs will increase. My question is, won't this now further slow economic growth, especially when businesses are already facing challenges?
Yeah, it's not ideal, because obviously access to finance is a big thing. If you're going to, we said the optimal or the ultimate is stimulate the private sector. They create jobs in an efficient manner. They contribute to the tax pot. So even what government spends has to come from the private sector, right? But as I've said, the issue of exchange rate is a question of lesser evils, right? You have a bad choice and the worst one. The bad choice, do you increase the cost of borrowing? The worst one, do you leave inflation uncontrolled, right? And I think from what has been argued and what I've seen, if I can use the term, the least worst option is to, for the time being, raise the cost of borrowing with a view of trying to rein in inflation. But from the discussion that we've had, you can see that it's only temporary. It's not the optimal, it's not the ideal, right? It has to work in tandem with all of these others. And when you then look at what has happened with these others, they may have been further along had we not had all the challenges that the economy or the country has had. If we agree that there have been significant challenges in the economy, significant challenges in the country, globally, locally, etc., you put that all together, then you'll see that the long-term solution to this is not what Bank of Zambia is doing. Bank of Zambia is a small piece of the equation, but they can have dramatic effects, as I've seen. But it's really, it's almost like a last resort to keep the situation controlled.
The IMF has projected Zambia's GDP growth at 6.6% for 2025. Do you see this as realistic, looking at the current economic conditions?
So I've been on record saying I thought it was ambitious initially. I mean, I haven't projected an actual number. There are a lot of things which need to fall into place for significant growth to be achieved. The energy situation and how that gets moderated, I think, is fundamental. But then if you also look at where the growth is expected to come from, the mining sector 2023 and I think 2024, if you look at their contribution to GDP, I haven't seen the final 2024 numbers, but in 2023 it was actually negative. They were one of the sectors that was subtracting from GDP growth. They're expected to rebound and rebound quite aggressively. And the mining sector has largely been able to insulate itself from things like the power crisis because they've set up their own mechanisms to import power from outside through power traders and their own mechanisms. So that's why, despite Zambia having a drought and the energy crisis, we've been told copper production has actually increased, right? That's miraculous under the circumstances, right? Just that on its own. So there are certain bits of the big pieces of the economy which were in decline, which are expected to rebound. The two biggest ones, mining, agriculture. The dependency for agriculture versus what happens with the rain, and so far it looks as though it's holding out, that the output would be a lot better than the previous year. So we could have we should have a much better 2025 than 2024. Whether we'll get to 6.6, I'm not sure, but it should definitely be on upward trajectory. That's what I feel.
What other things do you feel government must put in place for us to be able to achieve this particular growth?
So really it's support for the private sector. So we've spoken about support for the private sector. So some of this is you sort of have to bucket it as well, short, medium, and long-term measures. So short-term measures, I'm quite happy with things like, for example, the the support facility with the Bank of Zambia is providing through financial institutions to lower the cost of funding for certain sectors. So stuff like that is quite important, is helpful. We saw what the targeted medium-term refinancing facility, which was 10 billion during COVID, did in terms of alleviating pressure on businesses. If businesses continue operating, they don't have to lay off people because their cost of borrowing is skyrocketing, has been cushioned slightly. So I think that's a good thing. I'd actually like to see that expanded or increased in terms of its size, but we'll take what's there, right? It's a good thing. There's been discussion around taxation of especially businesses and individuals. And I acknowledge the fact that if you look at this government, since 2021 to 2025, they've actually, if you aggregate it all, right, the government has actually given back more taxes than it's taken. If you look at corporate taxes, came down from 35 to 30%. There was incentives given to those who manufacture in multi-facility economic zones for export, up to 15 years. POI has actually been coming down progressively through adjustments in bands. Not significant, but still there. And there are other concessions that have been given to energy, to agriculture, etc., which have taken out of the tax pot. There have now proposals they've now been implemented to increase certain areas, which have obviously caused quite a bit of discussion. I'm not sure if the timing was particularly right. I mean, maybe staggered over some time. Maybe some of those could be moderated, things like export duties on precious stones and gold, for example, right? Because if you're trying to stimulate export and you don't yet have capacity to value add locally, then perhaps you need some of that, and it goes on, or you sort of phase it over a period of time. So I think a more phased approach for some of the policy measures would be ideal. The issue around, we spoke about financing. I've long since put an argument across that Zambia doesn't have a problem with interest rates from banks being too high. No. Zambia has a bigger problem with there being an inadequate diversity in the sources of capital. All right? What do I mean? If you and me start a business today, let's call it Andrew and Sons, right? Selling water or whatever. We start the business just today, we incorporate it, right? We need $10,000 to get off the ground. It doesn't matter how powerful our business plan is. The banks will never lend to us because we don't have a track record. That's not what banks do. Say we need 7 years, 5 years constructing our plant, then we start operating in year 6. There's no bank that will give you that. It's just not how they work, right? What we need is a development bank, potentially, right? That will give us lower interest rate. They'll give us 3-year moratorium on repayments. They'll even give us technical support to come and help us get our business off the ground because they believe our idea is great. A bank will never lend based on an idea. The development bank, a venture capitalist, those sorts of structures or those sorts of segments may, right? If you think about our stock market, right? Not every entity that's looking to borrow, to raise funds needs a bank loan. They need equity, right? But why is it that our stock market is not being utilized? When was the last time I had a listing, for example, right? For some of the entities that are there. So what we need is a fully functioning financing mechanism in the background, actually not even the background, in the foreground, such that those who are bank customers, they go to the bank. Those who need development finance because their projects are early phase, they are still more idea than implementation, but it's something that's got a track record, they go and get that type of finance. Those who need venture capital. Now, some of these are meant to be private sector driven, right? So we won't have the government setting up a venture capital fund per se. But what is it that has not enabled the thriving of such a sector within Zambia, despite there being massive opportunities in those sectors? So those are the areas that I think we need to explore. So what the government does from a policy perspective, at least in terms of structure, making sure it's stable, and consulting along the way. What we do from an access to capital and finance in terms of getting a situation where we've got more diversity therein. But remember, all of this doesn't really really make a difference if it doesn't trickle down
I was about to come to
the man on the streets.
I was about to come to that as we conclude on that in such a way. We've been obsessed as a people, as a government, and as a country with the numbers. We want our GDP to grow by 6.6%. We want our inflation to be between 6 to 8%.
Yeah.
To what extent do these numbers really, translate of our people? Do these numbers have a direct effect on improving the living conditions of our people?
Some do, some is indirect. But at the end of the day, the way that
and how do we make sure that
they do
with economic growth there's also there's human development that comes with it?
I think what we have to understand is what do each of those things which are measuring, because it's like checking the pulse of the country. That's what those macroeconomic indicators are, and each of them is telling you something, right? And for the country to be performing optimally, so as it's delivering for its citizens, you expect it to perform at a certain level, right? So when you say GDP is growing, what are you trying to do? GDP measures transactions, the value being created in the economy. So it means the greater the value being created in the economy, the greater the opportunities there are for individuals to make a living, right? Which are those individuals is a secondary issue, because they also need to align to where the opportunities are, what their skills are in order to tap into those. But what is clear is that if your economy is malfunctioning or the GDP growth is either low or negative, that means it's shrinking. But as the economy, if the economy is, it may even be growing at a slow rate. The issue is that the population is growing as well and maybe outgrowing the rate at which the economy itself is growing. So what do we mean? And this may be let's try and keep it, let's make it simple, right? In my house, right, I earn 10,000 kwacha as an argument, right? Let's assume that's my GDP, right? I've got 2 children. They've got school fees I need to pay. I need to feed them, all right? That 10,000 may be sufficient and we have a comfortable life. When I add a third and I'm still at 10,000 kwacha, maybe I move to 10,500. Do you see that I'm now starting to have a problem? Maybe I had 4, now I have 5 children, but my income is now 11,000. Can you see that potentially I'll end up with a problem? By the time I need to feed them school fees, clothe them, move around when going to work, etc. It's the same principle even with the country. What revenues the country is generating, the opportunities the country is generating, right? Are they sufficient for it to cater for its citizens? Sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly. Directly, the people that the government actually supports. Indirectly, creating an environment where there are opportunities where either entrepreneurs can make their money and pay their taxes, or people can get employed by those who are running businesses. So what you're doing at the end of the day is you're measuring the rate at which activity is happening so that you create opportunities for each person to fend for themselves. That's what you want at the end of the day. And today, what is optimal? So that's what when you're measuring GDP, that's what you're measuring. When you're measuring inflation, you're talking about whatever you're earning, that 11,000, can it buy you all your necessities for the month? So by the time you get to the middle of the month, it has run out, right? Such that even if you still had 2 children, if your inflation is not well controlled, if it's escalating, what was comfortable at 10,000 becomes uncomfortable. You now need 15,000, right? So that's why you measure those metrics, and that's why they're important. But like I said, the trickle-down effect is that you want to, and that's why stimulating investment, the president has been quite passionate about this, is important, because then what are you doing? You're creating more opportunities for citizens to go into the company and get employed, for those who are coming out of our schools to get employed, or to become suppliers to those new businesses that are coming up, either entrepreneurs or employees, whichever way. But at the end of the day, they're able to take care of themselves. Or if they are unable to, but the government then because there's enough activity or increasing activity going on in the economy, is generating additional resources in taxes and non-tax revenue, such that when you and me walk into the hospital, even if we don't pay, we'll still get treated, such that you and me can send out, the pressure of me paying school fees can decline because all of a sudden the government has said your children can come to school for free and still get quality education, right? That's how the value trickles down. So in some cases it's direct, in some cases it's indirect, but what you want is for your economy to be growing at such a level that it creates sufficient opportunities for everyone to make ends meet, pays into the treasury or provides the government also with the resources needed to do what they need to do to roll out their policy and care for the people. Now, doing that is easy to say, but is not always easy to achieve, as we have discussed.
Mr. Andrew Chibuye, thank you so much for making time to speak with us on Costa tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We've been discussing the increase in the MPR and the introduction of new banknotes and coins. My guest has been Senior Partner at PwC, Mr. Andrew Chibuye. Good night and God bless.